By mid-1963, the Beatles were now on a relentless schedule of touring, television appearances, radio interviews, and promotional photo shoots. The touring especially would fast become the bane of their lives. Their debut album had been released in March. It dominated the radio airwaves. They were now, unquestionably, the biggest band in Britain. The rise of the Beatles in such a short period could be acquainted to a fire taking over a burning building. Hundreds of girls now camped outside EMI's studios in hopes of catching a glimpse of them. Inside, they couldn't enter EMI's canteen without being swarmed by female fans. The fans had formed a group that leaked inside information as to when the Beatles would be recording. Those at EMI guessed this because any time a record session was booked, an hour or so before, a large group would always gather.
Crowds of teenage girls outside complaining that they don't want to mob you, they just want to speak to you. What do you think about this?
Well, have you ever tried talking to about 200 people at once?
In the world of pop music, EMI was now a dominating force. The top chart positions were held by the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and Billy J. Kramer, all groups produced by George Martin and signed to EMI. But attitudes to pop music were divided. It's seen by the older generation as a passing fad. That January, Decca Records had recorded Benjamin Britten conducting War Requiem. It will sell over 200,000 copies, a number unheard of for a current piece of classical music. But the release of With the Beatles marks a shift in attitudes. University students who looked down on the genre were buying copies at record numbers. The recording itself will be sandwiched in between touring dates. The sessions will see George record his first Beatles composition and struggle laying down both lead guitar and vocal at the same time. Their chaotic schedule will see them having to leave sessions while working on tracks to record for radio shows. Their songs will for the first time capture either the rushed or calm atmosphere they're written in, and with them now being a top-earning EMI group, they're upgraded from a 2 to a 4-track recorder. This is the story of With the Beatles. After a 2-week vacation, George Martin returns to EMI to begin recording for the Beatles' second album. The sessions for With the Beatles include George Martin as producer and engineers Norman Smith, Richard Langham and Geoff Emerick. Emerick, at this time, was still living with his parents. One night, when he was working late at EMI, they shelled out for him to be driven home in a Humber Super Snipe. He was awed to be chauffeured in such luxury. As time will go by, EMI will stop paying for this service and he'll be forced to make his own way home. Before they start the album, the group are required to record their third single for EMI. While George Martin had been on vacation in Spain, John and Paul were composing the single in a New York hotel room. On the 1st of July, the Beatles begin recording She Loves You. Their busy touring schedule hadn't seen them in the studio for months, and there was a lot of enthusiasm and energy from the group that day. Geoff Emerick was the first to arrive early in the morning. He entered just after the floors in Studio 2 had been freshly waxed. There was no sign of George Martin or Norman Smith, but he spotted Mal Evans setting up the equipment ready. As Geoff wandered in, he spotted another roadie he didn't recognise. Mal greeted him warmly and then announced, "Geoff Emerick, meet Neil Aspinall." Neil went to shake Geoff's hand, to which Geoff asked, "Where are the Beatles?" Aspinall gave him a funny look and replied, "The boys are out there in the alleyway having their picture taken." Mal then turned to Geoff and quipped, "I reckon your governor and his second-in-command are out there too," referring to George Martin and Norman Smith. Not long after, the entire group burst through the doors. They were accompanied by a man Emerick didn't recognise. He was dressed in a smart suit. With all the commotion, Emerick wasn't acknowledged by anyone. They were too busy talking about a fan who'd been taken away by the police. The only person to greet him was the man in the suit. He extended his hand and introduced himself as Brian Epstein. Epstein rarely would appear at sessions. He was very quiet when at the studio, though he was always polite to everyone there. Following that, George Martin and Brian Epstein headed up to the control room to discuss the recording schedule, and the two engineers began tracking the equipment. While Norman Smith was setting up the microphones, he took a look at the lyrics John and Paul had written out. When he saw the line, "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah," written over and over, he thought to himself, this is going to be a terrible song. Down in Studio 2, John, Paul and George sat playing the song on acoustic guitars for George Martin. George Martin sat on a high stool listening intently. When they came to the end of the song, George Harrison played an E major to close, while John and Paul played the third and fifths. The added chord created a more complex and impressive sound. George Martin was impressed, as was Norman Smith, who was surprised by what they'd done with what seemed like a throwaway song. As recording is set to begin, Norman Smith hears distortion being picked up on the microphone positioned by the bass amp. He sends Jeff Emerick down to move it back a few inches. While Emerick is moving the mic, he sees Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall heading out of the studio doors. At that point, they were off to the canteen to fetch some food supplies. Moments later, the two will bolt back through the doors breathless, and Mal will shout, "Fans!" The Beatles stop fiddling around with their instruments, and John snaps, "What the bloody hell are you on about?" Before Mal can answer, the door bursts open and a female fan runs into Studio 2. She runs straight towards Ringo. Neil instinctively launches at her and rugby tackles her to the ground. Mal dragged the sobbing girl out, and Neil informed the group the girls who'd been camped outside had overpowered the police and broken into EMI. When in there, they were racing around in search of the four while being chased by security and police. Neil stated, "It's a madhouse. You've got to see it to believe it." By this point, George, Brian and Norman were stood against the glass in the control room looking down. Brian Epstein, soon after, appeared climbing down the stairs, repeating, "Oh dear, oh dear." Norman shouted down to Jeff to call security, and the sound of Lennon laughing echoed through Studio 2. They decided to barricade the doors and continue recording. Throughout recording, Mal will give the group updates on the current siege of EMI. The excitement of the event bled through into the song, and "She Loves You" captured all the chaos that surrounded the Beatles. Production-wise, the song was a turning point for the group, an evolution that's credited to Norman Smith. For some time, he'd been thinking of ways to improve the Beatles' studio sound. He achieved this by doing two things. One, he used a compressor on both the bass and the drums individually, as opposed to the previous method of compressing both as one. And two, he used a different type of microphone to suspend over the drum kit when tracking the instrument. The technique was a revelation. Jeff Emerick expressed his approval of the sound, and for the first time, the two engineers were now operating as a team. They both agreed the song was destined to be a hit. Listening to the playback afterwards, Norman Smith was ecstatic. George Martin was quietly impressed. He simply stated, "Nice job, lads." It was clear to everyone "She Loves You" would be an even bigger hit than "Please Please Me." After the session was complete, the group began to walk down to EMI's canteen before Neil Aspinall warned them against it. Their celebrity has begun to cause irrational outbursts. The others heed his warning, but John shrugs it off. He walks out the door and decides to go and have a look for himself. Not long after, he appears back in the studio stating, "It's not worth it. Those girls are mad." Mal Evans is then sent to get some takeout food. Mal will take on the duty of fetching tea and sandwiches. That day in Studio 2, Emerick and Mal devise a makeshift canteen area. After the song's complete, the group begin recording the B-side to the single, "Get You in the End." It is later retitled, "I'll Get You." The enthusiasm by now had gone. The song itself wasn't anywhere near as good. In those days, artists weren't allowed in the mixing process, so none of the Beatles were present. This marked the first time Geoff Emerick saw a Beatles song through from the recording of the backing track to the final mix. With the single complete, sessions begin on the 18th of July. A night session is booked beginning at 7 p.m. Group don't have enough original compositions written, so they decide to include covers. This first session, they will record 4 cover songs to feature on the album. The first is titled You Really Got a Hold on Me. It had been Lennon's choice to include it. The group had performed the song ever since the first import copies reached Liverpool. Despite knowing the song so well, they still go through 11 takes. For the song, George Martin accompanies them on piano. They're not quite happy, but move on to the next song. The second track they begin, they've been performing live since 1960. Money voiced the view of pop groups who in those days typically had 3 years of earning at most. When interviewed by the NME at this time, Lennon stated his ambition was to be rich. George Martin again accompanies them on the piano that opens the track. As the track comes to a close, John changes the lyrics from all those lean greens to I wanna be free. The revised lyrics push the notion it's the freedom that money affords rather than the material possessions or general greed that is John's real ambition. After that, they begin the third cover song and the first of the album to feature George Harrison on lead vocal. The song is laid down in 3 tracks. After that, they move on to the last cover of the day. Till There Was You, first featured on the 1957 musical The Music Man, sang by Shirley Jones. But this was not when McCartney first heard the song. Till There Was You was covered a year later by Peggy Lee. She was one of Paul's favourite artists, and after repeated listens, he watched The Music Man in order to hear the original. Paul would rearrange the song with a Latin strumming pattern. In the early career of the band, they would use this song tactfully. It was a song they knew would appeal to fans of all ages and genres. It featured in their Royal Variety performance at the end of the year and when they first appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. That day, they laid down 3 tracks for the song. They're not satisfied with the results. The complex rhythm guitar doesn't allow for any mistakes, so it's decided to re-record it at a later date. In the control room, as engineer Geoff Emerick listens back to the song, he's astounded how much the Beatles have progressed since the first album. Emerick was not mixing by this point though. He's still at apprentice level and is assigned to stop and start the tape machines. But he watches closely and learns from Norman Smith. He later stated he, at this time, already imagined how he would mix the sessions. 12 days later, on July 30th, they return for their second session. A morning and evening session are booked for that day. Through the day, they will begin 2 original compositions and another cover song. They are also due to record at a radio station for the programme Saturday Club. Because of this, the sessions are carefully timed around the radio booking so the Beatles can continuously work until night time. They begin at 10 a.m. with the Motown hit Please Mr. Postman. They played the song many times live before, but not for a while. It took them some time to get the track while rehearsing. 9 tracks are laid down for Please Mr. Postman. For the mix, George Martin will overdub track 7 onto track 9 for the master. With the tracks complete, they're satisfied and eager to start the next song, which is their first original composition for the album. It Won't Be Long was one of John's songs. It borrowed from their previous composition, She Loves You, with both the liberal use of yeahs and the song ending in an E major 7. That day, they go through 10 takes. Following this, the group begin a remake of Till There Was You. During the session, Norman Smith experiments moving mics into different positions. The song's incomplete, but at 1:30 they have to leave the studio to go and record for the BBC. At 5 p.m, they return to EMI and continue recording tracks for It Won't Be Long. They rack up 23 tracks all in all before they feel satisfied. The finished product captures their sense of urgency that day. It's later decided the track will open the album. The second song they begin in the night session is also the second song George features on lead vocal. Chuck Berry originally composed it in E, but the group have used a common trick and dropped it an octave to D. This makes the vocal easier to sing. It was another song the group had been performing for years. Originally, it had been John who had sang lead, but George took over from him in '61. This inclusion could have been a deliberate attempt to appeal to an American audience. Their tour of the US by this point was imminent. Roll Over Beethoven was recorded in 5 takes, with overdubs added afterwards. For the remainder of the session, they start work on Paul's first composition for the album. All My Lovin' was the group's most complex piece of songwriting to date. Conflicting stories have come out about when Paul wrote the song. One states he thought of it while shaving, another on a tour bus while they were travelling with Roy Orbison. Either way, it's said the words were wrote out as poetry, then used as lyrics. This marks the first time Paul had written the lyrics first and the music second. For the song, John used a guitar technique known as playing triplets. The relentless style of rhythm playing was inspired by the Phil Spector hit "To Do Ron Ron," which was at this time in the UK charts. The song is complete in 13 takes. Up to this song, Lennon was seen by the general public as the group's foremost songwriter, with McCartney as a lesser partner. With this song, he began to be looked at as an equal. After the song's complete, the sessions are put on hold until September while the group continue to tour. While they're away, mono mixing takes place on the 21st of August. 2 days after this, their single She Loves You is released. Sessions continue on September the 11th. An afternoon and a night session have been booked. They begin at 2:30 with a recording of Ringo's first song for the album, I Wanna Be Your Man. The song was mainly a Paul composition. It was seen as pretty average stuff. A day previous, they'd offered the song to the Rolling Stones manager Andrew Oldham as the group was struggling to come up with a worthy composition.
Lennon, I think, spotted him and waved him over to come and say hello. He sort of said, you know, you look a bit down in the dumps, Andrew, what's wrong? And Andrew told him the situation, you know. I think probably hoping he might come up with a solution. And of course, Lennon said, yeah, we think we might have something for you.
They weren't going to offer anything that great, but they were happy for the group to record I Wanna Be Your Man. Meanwhile, the Beatles run through the song, and after 2 takes, they aren't feeling anything, so they decide to move on to another song that was originally written for Ringo. John's second composition for the album, titled Little Child, had been written in quick succession. McCartney never liked the song much and described it as album filler. As they hadn't played it live or barely practiced it, they were having a bit of difficulty with the song. Like the previous, they laid down just 2 tracks before giving up. They put both songs aside to finish another day. The next song they start on is a John composition titled All I've Got to Do. He wrote the song specifically for the American market. He later stated, the idea of calling a girl on the telephone was unthinkable to the British youth of the 60s. They run through 15 tracks and the song is complete by 6 p.m. The afternoon session ends and they take an hour off to eat. The group's night session begins at 7 p.m. The next song recorded is one of John's compositions titled Not a Second Time. There was little involvement by the others to add textures. It was purely a Lennon song with the other Beatles accompanying him with rhythm. The song also contained no backing vocals by George or Paul. The final song they work on that day is George's first ever composition. Don't Bother Me was written when George was sick in bed back in August. The doctor had ordered him to stay in bed, and with nothing to do, he began writing a song. He used a tape recorder and made a rough demo of how he wanted it to sound. There were no lyrics at this point, so he whistled the melody. George later stated it was an experiment to himself to see if he actually could write a song. It would not be until Help in '65 that another Harrison composition would feature on a Beatles record. That day, they go through 7 takes but aren't happy. They decide to try again tomorrow, and the session ends at 10:15 p.m. On the 12th of September, an afternoon and night session have been booked. The Beatles arrive at Studio 2 at 2:30 p.m. Before they can begin tracks for the album, they are booked to record a radio message to their Australian fans. They improvise a comical sing-along, and Paul and George say a few words.
Fellas, how much have you heard about Australia?
A lot. It's warm and sunny, and they keep all the convicts out there.
Yeah, we'll see you when we get there, we hope. And, thanks for buying all our records.
Following that, they begin work on one of Paul's old compositions titled Hold Me Tight. They'd first attempted to record the song for the Please Please Me sessions back in February, though Paul had actually written the song back in '61. On this day, they record 9 tracks. For the mix, George Martin will edit together takes 6 and 9 for the master. Neither Lennon or McCartney liked the song very much. McCartney later stated, the song was a failed attempt at a single, which then became an unacceptable album filler. Lennon described it as a pretty poor McCartney song that he was never interested in. Critics held the same view, and it is regarded as the worst song on the album. With that, the afternoon session ends and they break for dinner. At 7 p.m, the night session starts. They decide to go back over the songs put aside the day previous, starting with George's song Don't Bother Me. While recording, George complains about the difficulty of singing the lead vocal and performing the solo guitar at the same time. Lennon wants to achieve a dirty sound on his rhythm guitar, so he turns up the gain levels on his amp. George Martin is unhappy with the sound and suggests adding compression during the mix. George also adds another vocal to double his original. Next, they continue with yesterday's 2 abandoned songs, starting with Little Child. They lay down 15 tracks and complete the song. The last song of the day is a continuation of Ringo's I Wanna Be Your Man. They lay down 5 tracks, but time runs out before they're satisfied. For the second time, the song is put aside for a later date. Following this, the Beatles take their second ever vacation since signing with EMI. Work for the album will continue in just over a month. 30th of September, editing begins on the previous recorded songs. George Martin also records some overdubs on piano and organ. 17th of October, an afternoon and night session have been booked. The group arrive at 2:30 and begin recording their annual Christmas message for their fan club. This occasion marks the dawn of a new era for the group. From now on, they will be recording on 4-track recorders. The reason they've been installed for this session is the Beatles are due to record their latest single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. John and Paul had begun writing the song during their vacation. It was the first time in over a year they weren't rushed by touring or contractual obligations. They were on their vacation time so they could take as long as they needed. Paul had by this point moved into the Asher's family home, having met Jane Asher earlier that year. It was the basement, which had been converted into a music room, that now took over as the writing base for John and Paul. Previously, they'd written at Paul McCartney's childhood home, and in the future, it would be the attic in Paul's St. John's Wood home. On the encouragement of Brian Epstein, they write the song specifically to appeal to an American audience. In the basement, they both play piano and wait until something comes. When Paul hits an E minor, John stops and declares, "That's it, do that again." The entire track is then built on that single melody. Before recording for the single begins, they go back and re-record the first song they'd started for the album. They try just one take for You Really Got a Hold on Me. It didn't improve what they'd already done recorded though. It had actually been John's idea to go back and redo the song. Possibly, he believed recording it with the 4-track instead of the 2-track would improve it. The group aren't satisfied with the re-recording and George Martin insists what's previously recorded will be fine. For the master, George will combine various takes from July 18th to form the best track. With the remake abandoned, John tells George Martin to come down from the control room and listen to their next number one they've written. Jeff Emerick, who's listening in, also goes down to the studio. As they run through I Wanna Hold Your Hand, it's clear to everyone this will be a big hit. When they begin recording, it's clear they've practiced the song over. They sing confident and give a polished performance. Clearly, they'd used their time off to rehearse the song. Despite this, they still run through 17 takes. While singing, John flubs the lyrics a few times. This is something he would do throughout the whole of the Beatles' career. Afterwards, in the control room, the engineers listen to the playback. George Martin and Norman Smith get very excited. They can see the single being even bigger than She Loves You. Working with a 4-track recorder now gave Norman a lot more control when mixing. He divides the track as follows: John and George's guitars on one, drums and bass on the other, vocals on the third, and whatever George Martin sees best for the fourth. The first session of the day ends and the Beatles break for dinner. The group don't invite the engineers to eat with them. It's something they never did the whole time working at Abbey Road. On this day, Norman Smith and Jeff Emerick head to a pub to eat. Norman has by this point got a lot closer to Jeff. He's much like a father figure to him. At the table, he shows Emerick how to eat spaghetti bolognese with a spoon and fork. When the meal is over, they head back for the second session of the day. When they arrive back, they see an unfamiliar face in the control room. George Martin introduces the engineers to Dick James, the Beatles song publisher. James greets them warmly, then heads down the steps of Studio 2 to greet the Beatles. There, they're sat with their assistants Mal and Neil drinking cups of tea. When Lennon spots James, he shouts, "Hello, Dick." Paul immediately turns his back and ignores him, and George Harrison snaps, "Is Mr. James here to count his money?" James isn't affected and begins talking with John. Eventually, he gets the hint the others don't want him around and leaves. Jeff Emerick, who's listening in on the playback mic, is confused by the situation. Dick James would often show up to early Beatles sessions. John always entertained his presence, but the others held him with disdain. They felt he was making massive sums of money from them without doing anything to earn it. It would later add insult to injury when one Christmas he would give them each a present of Brute aftershave. To him, he was being generous. To them, it was laughable to be given the cheapest cologne available on the market. It was a testament to his money-pinching ways. Mal and Neil also had no respect for James. The Beatles spent their careers in a close group and were suspicious of anyone in a position of authority. Even their manager Brian Epstein knew this and kept his distance when they were recording. He would seldom visit, and even when he did, he would often stay in the control room. With the second session beginning, they start work on the B-side to the single. This Boy was written over John and Paul's vacation. It was played using just acoustic guitars, and like I Wanna Hold Your Hand, they ran through 17 takes. It took them a long time to get the song perfect. It was a complicated song due to the tempo in rhythm guitars and 3-part harmony. George Martin rehearsed the harmonies with them sat at the piano. He kept tweaking each of their parts until it was perfect. It was all a very time-consuming process. The two finished songs on the single were polar opposites. This Boy was gentle and clear, each instrument distinguishable, and the drums were played softly to avoid any bleed through on the mics. I Wanna Hold Your Hand, in stark contrast, was a cacophony of sound. The middle section had also been recorded separately. Norman Smith didn't do a great job on the mix, and if you listen with some studio headphones or monitor speakers to a high-res audio copy, you'll hear it's clearly been separately recorded and spliced on. Recording was now finished. After 4 more sessions of mixing on October 30th, the album was complete. With the Beatles was released on the 22nd of November. The single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, they released a week later. The song propelled the group to new heights. It had been carefully constructed lyrically to push a non-threatening, humble message of teenage innocence. Musically, With the Beatles saw the first appearance of major and minor sevenths and ninth chords in their work. Though, lyrically, the songs were simplistic. The reason being, all that mattered to John and Paul at this point was the words fit the sound they were honing. Lennon later admitted there was nothing in the lyrics, just sound and harmony. There was another reason too. It was out of necessity. The Beatles now had the US in their sights. Social acceptance had been the catalyst for the compositions. In essence, they wanted to ease into America without causing offence. Their contemporaries were amazed they were using such strong material as an album track and not saving it for their next single. It was to them just throwing songs away. Though critics would suggest the album contained filler, it's important to understand the difference between filler and a track you don't like. There was a conscious effort made by the group to give a standard of quality to every song. It was the first example of the Beatles turning the making of an album into an art form. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.